The first thing they told us about alien biology was that we would never fully understand it. The second thing they told us was to never touch one without clearance. I had no clearance. I had no training. I had a dying child in my arms who breathed in colors I didn't have names for, and a medical scanner that kept screaming at me in a language built for a species that wasn't mine. I am not a doctor. I am not a xenobiologist. I am not even particularly brave. I am a sanitation engineer on a deep space relay station at the edge of a sector that most people in the Interstellar Coalition have never heard of and would never bother to visit. My name is Marcus Ellery. I fix pipes. I unclog filtration systems. I argue with the vending machine on level 4 that keeps spitting out nutrient bars instead of real food. And, somehow, I was the only living thing standing between a 6-year-old Velhari child and the empty dark she was sliding toward. I want to be very clear about something before this story goes any further. I didn't save her because I was special. I didn't save her because humans are secretly the most adaptable, most resilient, most uniquely gifted species in the known galaxy, though I've heard that speech from a dozen admirals and diplomats, and it always sounds better in an auditorium than it does on a cold metal floor with alien blood on your hands and alarms going off in 3 different frequencies. I saved her, if saving is even the right word, because I was stubborn and stupid and I couldn't walk away. That's the whole secret of humanity, if you want it. We can't walk away. It has gotten us into more trouble than anything else in our evolutionary history. It has also, apparently, made us the most dangerous diplomatic asset in the known universe. Go figure. This is what happened. Relay Station Kessler 9 was the kind of place that existed on maps only because someone had to put it there. It sat at the intersection of 3 shipping lanes that nobody used anymore, a leftover from an era when the Coalition thought this sector was going to be important. It never became important. The war went a different direction, the trade routes shifted, and Kessler 9 became exactly what it was now: a fuel stop, a communication relay, and a very long assignment for people who either had nobody waiting for them back home or had too many people they were running from. I had been here 14 months. I had 6 more to go. I was counting them the way you count the last few swallows in a water bottle when you're not sure when the next one is coming. The station had a permanent population of 41 humans and, for the past 3 weeks, a rotating diplomatic contingent of Velhari. 7 adults and 1 child. The adults were here for trade negotiations with the 2 other alien species who occasionally used this station, the Drevathi, who looked like someone had stretched a crab into a person shape and called it done, and the Solmari, who were tall and thin and moved like smoke and had never once, in my entire time here, made eye contact with me. The Velhari were different. I had been warned about the Velhari before they arrived. The warning came from Station Commander Yevgenia Rask, who delivered most of her important information like she was reading from a safety manual she hadn't bothered to update in a decade. The Velhari, she told us, were a species with a complex honor culture. They valued personal space. They did not appreciate unsolicited contact. Their biology was sensitive to several compounds found in standard human hygiene products, so we were all required to switch to the unscented, coalition-approved alternatives for the duration of the visit. She said nothing that prepared me for Sarah. Sarah was the child. 6 years old, though Velhari years were slightly longer than ours, so she might have been closer to 7 by human reckoning. She had the same base features as the adult Velhari: the wide, slightly iridescent eyes, the thin secondary membrane that flicked over those eyes like a slow blink when she was thinking, the faint bioluminescent markings along her cheekbones, and the backs of her hands that shifted color depending on her mood. When she was happy, they were a pale gold. When she was curious, they went a deeper amber. When she was startled, they flashed briefly white. I first noticed her on my 3rd day of pipe maintenance in the station's lower residential section, where the diplomatic contingent had been housed. She was sitting cross-legged in the corridor outside her family's quarters, doing something with a set of small geometric objects that clicked together in patterns I couldn't follow, and she was staring at me with the unabashed, full-commitment stare that only small children and certain large predators are capable of. I stared back. It seemed rude not to. After about 10 seconds, her markings went amber. She picked up one of her geometric objects and held it out toward me like an offering. I looked down the corridor both ways. There was nobody else. She was definitely offering it to me. I crouched down so I wasn't looming over her and looked at it. It was a small, blue-green hexagonal shape with tiny notches cut along each edge. I didn't touch it. I remembered the briefing about not touching Velhari without clearance. But I pointed at one of the notches and raised my eyebrows, which is a gesture that transcends species approximately 40% of the time, I've found. Her markings went bright gold. She started talking. I understood none of it. But the tone was unmistakable. She was explaining, in the rapid and earnest way that children everywhere explain things they care about, exactly how this puzzle worked. She demonstrated with her other pieces. She got frustrated when one piece didn't fit where she wanted and made a small disgusted sound that I would have sworn was the same sound my 8-year-old niece made when her tablet froze mid-game. I laughed. I couldn't help it. She looked at me. Her markings flashed white briefly, startled. Then, they went gold again, and she made a sound that I can only describe as a trill. A small, bright, involuntary noise that in the context of everything happening around it could only have been a laugh. That was how it started. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah found me every day. She would materialize in whatever section I was working in, trailing behind her adult guardian Veth, a tall, serious Velhari woman who watched our interactions with an expression I couldn't read but who never stopped them, and she would show me things. New puzzles. Drawings she had made on a flat slate device. Twice she brought me food from the Velhari rations that I absolutely could not eat but accepted anyway and held carefully until she looked away and I could set it down. I started learning 4 or 5 words of Velhari. She started learning 4 or 5 words of English. We built a pigeon between us made of gestures and expressions and the universal grammar of a small person who wants to show an adult something and an adult who finds, to his own surprise, that he genuinely wants to see it. Her name wasn't actually Sarah. It was something longer and tonal that I couldn't produce correctly. She told me, with great patience, 3 times. The 3rd time I butchered it, she gave me the look of a child who has concluded that this adult is simply doing their best, and she pointed at herself and said, with deliberate care, Sarah. A gift. A simplification made for me. I called her Sarah from then on. On the 22nd day of the diplomatic visit, I was in sublevel 3 doing routine maintenance on the water filtration junction when the station alarms went off. Not the standard pressure alarms. Not the fire suppression system test. The medical emergency alert, 3 long tones, 2 short, repeating. The one that meant a life was actually at risk. I didn't think about it. I dropped my tools, I stood up, and I went toward the sound of the alarm because that is what you do when someone might be dying. You go toward it. Even when every sensible part of your brain is compiling a list of reasons why you are not qualified and not equipped and not the right person. The alarm was coming from the Velhari residential corridor. The scene I found, 3 adult Velhari standing in a cluster outside an open door, their markings cycling through colors I had never seen them use, a deep, rapid crimson that seemed to pulse with their breathing. Inside the room, on the floor, was Sarah. She was conscious but barely. She was curled on her side, her knees pulled to her chest, and her bioluminescent markings had gone almost entirely dark. Where they did show, they were a dull, grayish color, the color of something powering down. Her breathing was wrong. I could hear it from the doorway. Too fast and too shallow and catching on something that wasn't there. The Velhari station medical officer was not on station. He had been called back to the main coalition hub 2 days earlier for an emergency reassignment. The human medical officer, Dr. Patel, was on the far end of the station responding to a Drevathi crew member with a severe allergic reaction and was not answering her comm. The adult Velhari were looking at me. Not with hope. I want to be precise about this. They were not looking at me with hope. They were looking at me with the specific expression of people who have exhausted every other option and have arrived, at the end of their list, at the one thing they didn't want to have to use. Veth, Sarah's guardian, stepped aside from the door. That was all. She just stepped aside. I went in. There was a medical kit on the Velhari supply shelf, their own kit, not a human one. I couldn't read the labels. The symbols were Valhari script and I knew maybe 8 symbols total, and none of them were on these containers. The station's emergency medical scanner was human calibrated. I pulled it out of my kit anyway because it was the only tool I had and pointed it at Sarah. It screamed at me. Not literally, but the alert tone it produced was the closest a machine has ever come to screaming. Unknown biology. Unable to process. Unable to process. Unable to process. I set it down. I looked at Sarah. Her markings pulsed once, dim amber. She was looking at me. Her eyes found my face and they stayed there, and I understood, in a way that had nothing to do with language or biology or training, that she was very scared. I sat down on the floor next to her. I did not touch her. I had been told not to touch. But I sat down so that I was at her level and I said, very quietly, I'm here. I'm not leaving. She couldn't understand the words. She understood them anyway. Her markings pulsed amber again. Held. I looked up at Veth in the doorway. I pointed at the Valhari medical kit and I opened my hands in a gesture that I hoped communicated something like, help me understand this. Tell me what to do. I am here, I am willing, I am entirely out of my depth and I need you to meet me halfway. Veth looked at me for a long moment. Then, she came into the room. She crouched beside me. She picked up the first container from the medical kit, turned it in her long fingers, and then did something I will remember for the rest of my life. She looked straight at me, held up 2 fingers, and pointed at Sarah's chest. 2. Chest. She picked up the second container. 1 finger. Pointed at Sarah's throat. 1. Throat. She set them both down in the order she'd shown me. Then, she looked at me and held her own markings steady. They were still that frightened crimson, but beneath it, steady. Waiting. I picked up the first container. Looked at it. 2 doses. Chest area. She nodded. The membrane flickered over her eyes twice. I administered the first dose. Sarah made a sound. Her whole body flinched and I nearly dropped the container and Veth put one hand, not touching me, just near me, near my arm and held it there, and the steadiness of her presence was enough to keep my hands from shaking long enough to finish. The second container. 1 dose. Throat. Done. We waited. 60 seconds. Maybe 90. Long enough for me to become very aware of how cold the floor was and how loud the alarm still was and how completely and utterly alone I was in my competence to handle any outcome except the one where this worked. Sarah's markings began to come back. Slow. Tentative. Like a flame catching on wet wood. But they came back. Gold. Pale and uncertain, but gold. She uncurled slightly. Her breathing changed, still not right, but different. Less like something stopping and more like something finding its rhythm again. Veth made a sound. I had never heard a Valhari make that particular sound before. It was low and sustained and it cracked slightly at the end. I don't know what it means in their language. I know what it means everywhere. I sat back on my heels. My hands were shaking now, delayed, and I let them. Sarah's eyes found my face again. She was still scared, but the markings held gold. She said one word in Valhari. I didn't know it. Veth, very quietly, translated. Not in Valhari. In English, halting, accented, but clear. She says, you stayed. I looked at Sarah. Her markings pulsed. Yeah, I said. I stayed. That was the end of the beginning. What came next was larger than me and larger than Sarah and larger than the narrow corridor of a relay station that nobody had bothered to make important. But it started there, on a cold floor, with a dying child and a man who couldn't walk away and 2 adults who met each other in the space between what they each knew and found that the overlap was just barely enough. Just barely enough is sometimes all you need. The station alarm shut off. The sudden silence was enormous. Somewhere on the far end of the station, Dr. Patel's calm finally connected. Her voice came through the speaker system, clipped and professional. "Medical emergency, what's the patient's status?" I looked at Sarah. Her markings were gold and getting stronger. "Stabilizing," I said into my comm. It was the most accurate thing I had said all day. Dr. Patel arrived 40 minutes later and spent the next 2 hours doing things with Sarah that I was not qualified to watch and was told firmly, twice, to step back from. I stepped back. I sat in the corridor outside the room and I stared at the wall and I thought about pipes. This is a real thing I did. When my brain gets too loud, I think about pipes. The logic of plumbing is clean and physical and completely indifferent to the mess of everything else. Pressure differential. Flow rate. The path of least resistance. Things go from where there is more to where there is less, and the job is just to make sure they go there without leaking. There is nothing ambiguous about it. I was still thinking about pipes when Veth sat down next to me in the corridor. She sat the way Valhari adults sat, spine very straight, hands folded in her lap, an economy of motion that made every human sitting posture look like a controlled collapse by comparison. Her markings had come down from the crisis crimson. They were a deep, settled blue now. I didn't know what blue meant. We sat in silence for a while. The station hummed around us. Somewhere on the upper level someone dropped something metal and it rang out sharp and clear and then stopped. Veth said, in her careful English, "You were afraid." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "You helped anyway." "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, she said something that I have thought about almost every day since. "Among my people, we have a concept. It does not translate exactly. The closest your language comes is deliberate courage. Courage that knows it is afraid and does the thing because the thing must be done. Not bravery. Bravery does not know fear. This is different. This is choosing." She paused. "We have a word for people who do this." I waited. "You have earned the use of it," she said. I didn't know what the word was. She didn't tell me yet. But the weight of the statement settled on me like something physical, and I understood that it was not a small thing she had just said. "Sarah," I said. "Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Patel believes so. The episode was a reaction. Our medical officer would have known immediately. The signs were clear in Valhari physiology. For a human, they would not be visible. A pause. We did not anticipate this. The supplies required were standard, but the knowledge to use them, she stopped. "You had no reason to know." "I didn't know," I said. "Veth, I want to be honest with you. I had no idea what I was doing. I was following your instructions. I knew nothing." She looked at me for a moment with those wide, iridescent eyes. "Yes," she said. "That is also something we have a word for." I didn't know what that word was either, but her tone had shifted slightly, a register that I was beginning to be able to read. "Warmer. The way you talk about something that surprised you into liking it." The door opened. Dr. Patel came out. She was a small, efficient woman who had been a field medic on 3 different conflict zones before ending up at Kessler 9 and who therefore had the specific quality of a person who has seen almost everything and has accordingly decided to be calm about most things. She looked at me. Then, she looked at Veth. Then, back at me. "Walk me through what you gave her and, in what order," she said. I told her. She listened without expression. When I finished, she nodded once. "You were lucky," she said. "The doses were correct. The order was correct. If either had been wrong, she would likely have had a vascular episode within 20 minutes. She held my gaze. "What made you confident in the order?" "I wasn't confident," I said. Veth showed me. Patel looked at Veth. Something passed between them, adult to adult, the specific communication of 2 people who are each reassessing a situation they thought they understood. She's resting, Patel said. She'll need monitoring for the next 48 hours, but her readings are normalizing. Given that we're working across species, I'm hesitant to project outcomes too confidently, but she almost smiled. It was a small and controlled almost smile, the kind that has been trained by years of not getting attached to outcomes. She looks like a kid who was going to drive everyone around her thoroughly crazy for a very long time. I felt something a knot in my chest. What happened next took place over the following week, and I'll try to tell it honestly, which means telling the parts that were uncomfortable as well as the parts that felt good. The Velhari diplomatic contingent had a meeting about me. Not with me, about me. I was told this by Rask, who was told by the Velhari senior diplomat, a man named Oreth who had the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where every word cost something. I was told that the meeting had been long, and that there had been significant disagreement, and that the disagreement had centered on what my involvement with Sarah now meant according to Velhari custom. Rask explained this to me in her office with the careful tone of a woman defusing something. In Velhari culture, she said, when an adult outside the family unit performed a life-preserving act for a child, it created what translated roughly as a bond of obligation. Not legally binding by coalition standards, but deeply socially binding by Velhari standards. The adult who had saved the child was considered, in a sense that was more than metaphorical, to have taken on a kind of extended family role. A guardian-adjacent status. The disagreement in the Velhari meeting, Rask told me, was between those who felt this applied to my situation and those who argued that the context, an alien, a station worker, an emergency with no real alternatives, made the tradition inapplicable. What did they decide? I asked. Rask looked at me. They're still deciding, she said. Oreth wants to speak with you. Oreth received me in the station's secondary conference room the next morning. He sat across from me at the table with two other senior Velhari, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. You understand, he said, that among my people what you did is not a small thing. Commander Rask explained some of it, I said. Some. He tilted his head slightly. You saved my grandchild's life. This is a fact. It is not disputed. What is disputed is what it means for you, for us, for the relationship between our peoples, given that the relationship between our peoples is currently in a state of delicate negotiation and your government did not authorize your involvement in our internal medical situation. This was new information. I processed it. Is my government angry? Your government is in the position of having to decide whether what you did was an act of humanitarian aid or an unauthorized intervention into the internal affairs of a Velhari family on sovereign diplomatic territory. He folded his hands on the table. The coalition lawyers are arguing about it. I looked at him. Is Sarah okay? He paused. The membrane flickered over his eyes. She is well, he said. She has been asking for you. There it was. Under all the politics and the protocol and the layers of what it meant for governments and customs and centuries-old traditions of who owes what to whom, a 6-year-old girl who wanted to see the person who had stayed. I would very much like to see her, I said. Oreth looked at me for another long moment. There are those among us, he said slowly, who feel that the tradition should not apply. That we should note what you did, express formal gratitude through the appropriate diplomatic channels, and close the matter. And the others? The others feel, he stopped. He looked at his hands. It was the first uncertain gesture I had seen him make, and it made him look, briefly, like a person rather than a diplomat. The others feel that a man who sits on a cold floor next to a frightened child and says he is not leaving, that man has already answered the question of what he is to her. Whatever the tradition says. I didn't say anything. You are not Velhari, he said. No. You do not know our customs. Not well. You do not know what you would be taking on if the tradition were applied. The obligations run in both directions. It is not simply an honor. It is a responsibility. I thought about Sarah's markings going gold on that floor. The word she had said. You stayed. Tell me what it involves, I said. He told me. It took about an hour. It was complex and specific and involved several categories of commitment that had no good translation into human customs, things about being available at certain ceremonial junctures, about the right of the child to call on the guardian adjacent for guidance at specific life transitions, about the public acknowledgement that came with the role and what it meant for how other Velhari would perceive me. I listened to all of it. "Can I ask you something?" I said, when he was done. "Yes." "Is any of this bad for Sarah?" "The not applying version, I mean. If you close the matter through diplomatic channels, does that hurt her in some way?" He was quiet for a moment. Velhari children who have had a bonding experience of this nature, and who then see it formally dissolved, there is a word for what this does. I will not tell you the word, because I do not think your language has one that carries the same weight. But I will tell you that it is not nothing. 30 seconds of silence. "I'll do it," I said. Orath looked at me. His markings, I had been slowly learning to read them, shifted. Not the gold of happiness, not quite. Something steadier. Something that looked like it had been waiting to be that color for a long time. "You understand this binds you," he said. "I understand. You are a sanitation engineer on a relay station." "That is accurate. This will follow you when you leave Kessler 9. Into whatever comes next." "I know." He looked at me for one more long moment. Then, he said the word. The word he had told me I had earned, that first night in the corridor. I can't reproduce it in writing. It's tonal and it involves a register my vocal cords can't hit. But he told me what it meant, in his careful, weighted way. It meant, roughly, one who chooses to act in full knowledge of the cost. I sat with that for a moment. "That's a lot for a guy who fixes pipes," I said. Something happened to his face then. Something I can only describe as the expression of a man who has been negotiating with governments for decades and has just been surprised into genuine amusement by a sentence he did not expect. The membrane flickered. Both sides. "Perhaps," he said, "that is why it fits." When they brought Sarah in, she walked straight to me and she held up one of her small geometric puzzle pieces. The gold-green hexagonal one. She placed it in my hand. I held it. I looked at it. I looked at her. Her markings were the brightest gold I had ever seen them. I didn't say anything. I closed my fingers around the puzzle piece. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. But the thing about everything is that it is almost never actually the end. It is usually the point at which the real story begins, the one that is larger and harder and asks more of you than you thought you had signed up for. 3 days later, an encoded message arrived at Kessler 9 from the Velhari homeworld. It was addressed to me. It was not from Sarah. It was from the Velhari High Council, and it was short, and it said something that I read 3 times before I accepted that I was reading it correctly. It said that the act I had performed, and the bond one had accepted, had been noted at the highest level of Velhari governance. It said that given the current state of negotiations between the Velhari Confederacy and the Human Coalition, and given certain complications that had arisen in those negotiations in the past 72 hours, my involvement was no longer a private matter. It said that I had been formally requested, not ordered, requested, to travel to the Velhari homeworld. It said that the request came from the Council's diplomatic chair, who was the person responsible for determining whether the current negotiations collapsed entirely or found some new ground to stand on. It said that the diplomatic chair had reviewed the record of what I had done on the night of the medical emergency, and of what I had agreed to in Orith's conference room, and had made a decision that I did not expect. The diplomatic chair wanted a human who had, as the message put it, already demonstrated that they understand the difference between what a situation requires and what a person is comfortable with. The diplomatic chair wanted me in the room. Not Ambassador Holloway. Not the coalition's chief negotiator. Not any of the 17 people with actual diplomatic training who are currently failing to hold the Velhari talks together. Me. A man who fixed pipes, who had stumbled into a dying child's room in the middle of the night, who had said I'm not leaving to someone who couldn't understand the words. I set the message down. I picked up Sarah's puzzle piece from where it sat on my desk. I turned it over in my fingers. 14 months at Kessler 9. 6 more to go. A vending machine on level 4 that still wouldn't give me real food. A job I understood and was good at and which asked nothing from me that I couldn't give. I thought about pipes. The path of least resistance. Things go from where there is more to where there is less. Then, I thought about Sarah's markings going dark on that floor. Gold. Pale and uncertain, but gold. I picked up my comrask, I said. I need to talk to you about travel arrangements. The Velhari homeworld was called Vethalara, which translated loosely as the world that remembers, and the first thing I noticed when the transport broke atmosphere was that the sky was 2 colors at once. Not a gradient, 2 distinct, simultaneous colors, a deep violet blue at the high altitude and a warm amber below it, as though the sky itself couldn't decide and had simply chosen to be both. The second thing I noticed was that I had never been so aware of being human in my life. It is one thing to be the only human on a relay station. At a relay station, you are a worker, a body moving through corridors, a person with a job. The station doesn't care what species you are as long as you keep the filtration running. Vethalara was a planet of 2 billion Velhari, and I had been on the ground for 40 minutes, and every single one of them who passed me in the transit hub looked at me with an expression that was some combination of curiosity, appraisal, and a carefully maintained diplomatic blankness that told me very little except that they were being very careful about what it told me. Oreth met me at the hub. He had a small team with him, aides, I gathered, though they had the quiet, ready quality of people who were also security if security became necessary. He greeted me formally, a gesture that involved a slight lowering of the head and both hands held open at his sides, and I did my best approximation of it back. His marking went briefly, almost invisibly amber. I had passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. The council will see you in 2 days, he said, as we walked. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow, you will be briefed. Briefed on what? I asked. On what the negotiations have become. He paused. On why they are failing. The room they gave me was clean and spare and built for a species slightly taller than me, which meant all the surfaces were at a height that made me feel like I was in a house that had been designed for my older brother. The window looked out over a city that moved differently than human cities, the traffic patterns, the clustering of buildings, the rhythm of how people gathered and dispersed in public spaces. All of it had the same quality as the Velhari adults I had known: economical, deliberate, nothing wasted. I slept badly. I dreamed about Sarah's markings going dark. The briefing the next morning was delivered by a Velhari named Thessan who had the specific energy of someone who has been told to explain something very complicated to someone who does not have the background to fully understand it and who has decided to do this with patience and without condescension, which is a rare combination in any species. She told me the shape of the negotiations as they stood. The Velhari Confederacy and the Human Coalition had been negotiating a mutual development treaty for 3 years. The treaty covered resource access in a disputed belt of systems between Velhari and human territory, systems that neither side had fully developed but both sides had historical claims to, and which both sides' scientific assessments suggested were going to be critically valuable in the next century. The negotiations had been going reasonably well until, roughly 4 months ago, a diplomatic incident had occurred on the human side. I won't recount the full details because Thessan's briefing took 3 hours and most of the nuances beyond my ability to convey accurately. The summary is this: a senior human diplomat, in a private session, had said something about Velhari family structure that was understood, in the Velhari cultural context, as a profound insult. Not because it was intended as an insult. It was intended as a concession, a compromise offer framed in terms that the human diplomat believed would be understood as respectful accommodation of cultural difference. What it communicated, in the Velhari understanding of the terms being used, was that humans viewed Velhari family bonds as contractual arrangements that could be renegotiated under sufficient economic pressure. That the Velhari concept of family obligation was, from the human perspective, a bargaining chip. There was no recovering from it through normal channels. The Velhari High Council had reviewed every draft response that the human diplomatic team had submitted and found each one inadequate, not because the drafts were poorly constructed, but because the drafts were doing what diplomatic language does: it smooths, it hedges, it surrounds the actual meaning with enough cushion that the meaning becomes deniable. And what the council needed was not deniability. What they needed was someone who had already, in an unambiguous and unrepeatable way, demonstrated that they understood what Velhari family bonds actually were. Not abstractly. Not in policy language. Sitting on a cold floor and refusing to leave. That was what Thessan told me. That was why I was here. The council's chair, I said. What does she want from me specifically? She wants you in the room when the next session opens, Thessan said. She wants you to speak. Not a prepared statement, the council will know if it's prepared. She wants you to speak to what happened with Sarah. I thought about this. She wants me to tell the story. She wants the human delegation to hear it told by a human who lived it, in the presence of the council, so that the human delegation understands what they insulted. Thessan paused. And, so that the council can see whether the human delegation is capable of understanding. It was elegant and, it was ruthless and, it was, I realized, exactly what I would have designed if I had been trying to find a way to cut through 3 years of diplomatic language and get to the actual thing underneath. What if it doesn't work? I said. Then, the treaty fails and, the disputed systems go into contested status for the next 40 years and, 2 species who could have been allies become something more complicated instead. I sat with that. No pressure, I said. Thessan's markings went briefly amber. The Velhari equivalent of a Winslav. The council session was held in a circular chamber that was older than any building I had ever been in. The walls were carved in a specific way that I learned later was a record. Every major treaty, every significant agreement, every formal bond of any importance that the Velhari Confederacy had made or witnessed for the past 800 years was recorded in those walls. Every mark was deliberate. Every mark was permanent. I walked in behind Orith and I did not look at the human delegation until I was seated, because I had been told that looking first at your own people in a Velhari formal chamber was understood as bringing your loyalties into the room as a weapon, and I was here to do the opposite of that. Ambassador Holloway was watching me when I finally looked. She was a tall woman with a diplomat's face, professionally neutral, professionally attentive, but there was something behind it that I recognized from a different context. She looked the way Dr. Patel had looked, walking in on a situation she hadn't controlled. The council's chair was a woman named Virata. She was old, the oldest Velhari I had seen, her markings dimmer and more constant than the younger ones, less reactive, as though decades of experience had taught her body to stop announcing every feeling. She looked at me for a long time before she spoke. She welcomed me by using the word Orith had used in the corridor. The one I'd been told I'd earned. In this room, in this context, with the treaty walls behind her, the weight of it landed differently. I felt the human delegation shift. They didn't know the word, but they could hear what it was doing. Virata asked me to speak. I told the story. Not a prepared version. The version that was actually true, with all the parts that made me look less than competent, the alarm going off and my legs just starting to move before my brain gave permission, the medical scanner screaming unknown biology at me, the moment I sat down on the floor because I had run out of things I knew how to do and the only thing left was to just be there. Veth showing me 2 fingers and 1 finger and trusting me with that impossibly small amount of information and it being exactly enough. Sarah's markings going dark. Gold. Dark. Gold. The word she said. You stayed. I told it the way it happened. In the room, in the silence, it was very large. When I finished, Virata was quiet for a long moment. The council was quiet. The entire chamber was quiet in the way that spaces get quiet when something true has just been said in them. Then, she looked at Ambassador Holloway. You understand now, she said. It was not a question. Holloway was quiet for a moment. She was a diplomat and she was good at her job, and I watched her process, watched the instinct to frame and cushion and hedge come up against something that simply didn't need it. Yes, she said. I understand now. What do you understand? Another pause. That when your diplomat used those words about obligation being conditional on circumstance, he told you that we see your children the way we see contracts. Her voice was even. That is not what we believe. That is not what we are. And, I am sorry. Not as a formality. As a fact. Silence. Then, Barada said, very quietly, something in Velhari. Orith, beside me, leaned close. She says, this is the beginning. The negotiations did not resolve that day. Treaties between civilizations don't work that way. There were 18 months of additional sessions after Vethalara, drafts and counterdrafts and complications I was not in the room for. I went back to Kessler 9. I fixed pipes. I served out the last 6 months of my assignment and then I went home, and home turned out to be smaller and quieter than I remembered, which is a thing that happens to people who have been changed by something and don't yet have the vocabulary for how. The treaty was signed 14 months after the Vethalara session. I watched the announcement on a newsfeed in my apartment. The disputed systems were designated a joint development zone under a structure that neither side had proposed at the outset, something that had come out of the sessions after, built on a foundation that had somehow been poured in an old chamber with carved walls by a man telling a story he had lived. Orith sent me a message when it was signed. It said, in English, you stayed, and the echo carries. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I sat with it for a while. 3 weeks after the signing, a small package arrived. Physical delivery, actual matter, shipped across actual space, which is not cheap and, therefore means something when someone does it. Inside was a geometric puzzle piece. Blue-green hexagonal. With tiny notches along each edge. I held it in my hand for a long time. There was a message folded underneath it, written in a child's unpracticed English, each letter large and careful and slightly wobbly, the handwriting of someone who was working very hard at something that doesn't come easily yet. It said, you stayed. I am learning English. It is hard. This piece goes in the middle and everything else connects to it. I think you are like this. Sarah. I set the puzzle piece on my desk. I have moved 4 times since Kessler 9 and it has come with me every time. It sits wherever I work now, on top of whatever I'm currently dealing with, whatever assignment or problem or thing I don't fully understand and am trying to figure out anyway. It goes in the middle and everything else connects to it. I think about that when things are hard. When the problem is bigger than my training and the scanner is screaming unknown biology at me and there's nothing left to do except sit down on the floor and not leave. That's the whole secret. You stay. The echo carries. And 2 species who might have spent 40 years as something complicated instead learned, in a carved room on a 2-colored world, that the distance between us was not as large as the language made it seem. It was exactly the width of a cold floor. And a man who fixed pipes. And a child who needed someone to not walk away.